Good
morning, Boker Tov, everyone. So today is a very special day. It's the day after Tisha B'av. Yesterday was the fast day of Tisha B'av. And
the longest, the hardest.
It's a long fast day. It's a hard fast day. It was also very humid in Montreal. So it's not easy to fast, but we made it through. But more importantly is the reason why we fast and the fact that we still fast, given that it's been so many years since the temple was destroyed, and you sit down and you read the Eicha and you realize that part of our liturgy is to cry over a temple that was destroyed almost 2,000 years ago. It really creates that sense of connection with history, that it is so much part of who we are today. And more than that, that the rabbis instituted, very interestingly enough, that on the day of Tisha B'av, there should be a memorial for all travesties and all tragedies that befell the Jewish people in general, not only on the 9th day of Av. And so we see that during the Crusades and during other times of pogroms of the Jewish people, there were times when they wrote lamentations for the destruction of the Jewish community. So, for example, we have that there was during the time of the Crusades, we have that all the communities along the Rhine River were completely decimated and destroyed, and people were killed, and women were raped. They never recovered. This was a community that was established after the destruction of the first temple. So after the destruction of the first temple, there were Jews who were exiled out of the land of Israel to Babylon, and from Babylon, some of them made their way to Europe. And so the communities along the Rhineland, the communities of Speyer, Mainz, and Bregenz, these communities were very ancient. The official recorded history goes back to the 700s, but Jewish history records that these communities existed really from the time of the destruction of the first temple, and always flourished, and there was tremendous Torah scholarship there. And then during the Crusades, these communities somehow managed to earn the wrath of the Crusaders on the way to the temple, on the way to Israel. I guess they wanted to have more action than they were having, and they turned on these communities. And at first the communities were shielded by the local rulers or the bishops, but eventually they were all destroyed, and they never were able to come back to their original prowess, to the original strength. And also we have different tragedies that happened to the Jewish people. The burning of the Talmud in France in the 1200s, I think it was 1242, that really decimated the emotional strength of the Jewish people, because all the Talmuds were burned. And it took such a long time in those days. It was before the printing press, so it took such a long time to write one Talmud. If you ever saw a set of Talmud, it's many volumes. It's huge, and to write a whole set of Talmud would take years by hand, penmanship by hand, to copy the Talmud. And here, almost all the Talmuds were confiscated and they were burned. There are 24 wagon loads of Talmuds that were burned. And after that, the communities in southern France, and this happened in Montpellier actually, the community in southern France were completely decimated and didn't return to their previous stature. So we have these incidents, the story of the Jewish people. It's truly the story of these microaggressions and these macroaggressions and these great aggressions that happen to the Jewish people throughout history, that starts with the destruction of the temple. And so we see in the Lamentations that we just read yesterday on Tisha B'av are the Lamentations for different destructions that happened to the Jews of Europe. And there the rabbis who wrote the Lamentations, oh, thanks about the watermelon chip, okay. And the rabbis who wrote the Lamentations wrote, we don't have the wherewithal to introduce a new holiday, a new fast day, a new day of memorial. So what we're going to do is we're going to shepherd everything into the memorial of Tisha B'av, and there we're going to mourn all the lamentations. And so what we find is after the Holocaust, after World War II, we find that a similar set of lamentations is written for the Holocaust. So notably, we have a lamentation from the Rebbe of Bava. We have a lamentation from Rabbi Schwab, who was a German rabbi. And we have the lamentations of other rabbis, Rabbi Weissmandel, different people who were actually victims and survivors of the Holocaust who wrote these lamentations. So today, Tisha B'av is also a day where the Holocaust, yes, and on the rockets that came down on Tisha B'av, the Holocaust is actually mourned on Tisha B'av. And so you'll find traditionally that people will read Holocaust literature, watch Holocaust movies, and cry for the Holocaust. I'm not sure if you know, but there was a lot of, when they made Holocaust Memorial Day, and in Israel, they have it right before they have the day of the Memorial Day is for the Holocaust is the day that they remember is through the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because Israel, I guess, identified with the resistance to the Nazis, being that the Jewish state is like the answer to a physical oppression through our own army and so on and so forth. And not all the rabbis signed up on it. And the reason they didn't sign up on it, people say, how come the rabbis were not into a Holocaust Memorial Day? And the rabbis feel that all memorials and all crying should be channeled into Tisha B'av, because that's a day of fasting. It's a day that we actually have the seriousness that we have to have. You know, when you're hungry, suddenly you pay attention to the agenda on the program. When you're eating and you're, even if you're memorializing the Holocaust, if you're having a nice brunch with it, it doesn't have the same meaning as the restrictions of Tisha B'av, which goes above and beyond fasting. Until 1 o'clock, we're only allowed to sit on a low stool or on the floor. We're supposed to deprive ourselves of all the things that we deprive ourselves during Yom Kippur. It's quite a serious fast, and it's a fast that is very unpleasant, because we really have to, I guess, what the Torah describes as inu es nafshe seichem, you should withhold or afflict your souls. And so this comes after 9 days where we're not allowed to do the regular grooming that we usually do. And so by the time you get to Tisha B'av, you're kind of down and tired. And so what we have with this lamentation is really a true time to get into what the Holocaust, the devastation of the Holocaust. You're tired, you're hungry, and you're reading about suffering, and you're much more focused. And so that's one reason why the rabbi said, like, that they said the reason why the rabbis post World War II said we shouldn't make a Holocaust Memorial Day is because they saw that those who survived different pogroms, and especially the Crusades, which were very, very devastating to the Jewish people in Europe, that they wrote in their poetry, in their piyutim, in their lamentations that they wrote for the events of what happened along the Rhineland. They said, it is not up to us to create a new day of fasting or a new day of prayer, because we don't have the authority to do so. So we're going to ask that it's done on Tisha B'av. The other thing, and not comically, but truly, is that God forbid if the Jewish people would have to commemorate all the days in the calendar that bad things happen to us, we would be literally fasting around the calendar. We wouldn't be able to live a normal life. And to live a Jewish life is to live both with the memory of the travesty of what happened to the Jewish people, but also with great hope and with great life for the future. And that is the paradox of being a Jew. At the one hand, we do mourn for the temple, and we do mourn for the tragedies that befell the Jewish people. And we understand that as long as the temple is not rebuilt and there isn't world peace, and people have not been healed of their hate and of their illnesses, there is always a chance for some devastation to happen again to the Jewish people or even to other peoples. But certainly from the perspective of the Jewish people, there's always a feeling of unease. Someone just texted before on the message board that yesterday 1,000 rockets rained into Israel. And it underscores so strongly, I think, that I asked myself, how come the Israelis made their strike, during the 9 days? It's not a day that's auspicious for the Jewish people. But then I realized it's actually a good message, because a lot of the lamentations that we read on Tisha B'av decry the fact that, Judah was destroyed, Jerusalem is no more. And it's easy to say, okay, there was a time to cry for that, but now we actually see that so many of the prophecies that are the positive prophecies, the prophecies of that the cities of Jerusalem will be filled with young children playing, and that people who are in old age are going to be living such a long life that they'll be able to sit and watch the children play. They'll have enough good health that they'll be able to watch the children play. And this is one of the prophecies. And so we see that we do have the rebuilding of Jerusalem. If you look at Jerusalem at any time, it is filled with building cranes. And one of the things that I've learned on my trips to Israel, which have not been so close together, was that every time I visited Israel, I actually visited a different Israel, because it was been so rebuilt and so beautified. And really, Jerusalem that I visited 10 years ago was not the Jerusalem that I visited a couple of years ago. Just so beautiful, magnificent. Everything is vibrant, and so a person can be excused for saying, do the lamentations still apply? And then you'll have a current event like we have now, which is that Israel is being barraged with rockets as a result of an activity that they did to destroy terrorists. And it happens right around Tisha B'av. And so the answer is right in front of our eyes, that history is telling us now that as long as we don't have world peace, and as long as we don't have the rebuilding of the temple, we still have to pray and we still have to cry, and we can't be satisfied with an Israel that still has to suffer. And for the people who live, I just can't imagine it. For the people who live in towns that are more prone to these attacks, how difficult it is. I had my son was in yeshiva in Israel, and his yeshiva is in the south of Israel, and so the yeshiva did not have a big enough, I guess, underground shelter, so they had all the boys go home. My son, being an out-of-towner, could not go home, so he went to Jerusalem with some friends, and then what do we know? That the rockets were falling the last time they had a Gaza operation. The rockets are falling on Jerusalem. So I'm calling my son, and I said to him, "Where are you?" And he said to me, "I'm going to Tel Aviv." And I said, "Don't go to Tel Aviv. They say there's rockets falling everywhere." And then I'm on the phone with him. He's on the bus, and he says, "Mommy, I have to get up. There's a siren. We have to run into a building." And I'm like, "Oh gosh, okay. Go somewhere safe. What are you doing to me?" And so it made me understand what people who live there live through, and it's almost like the realization of what we're missing on this day. And certainly when people come to pray at the Kotel, if any of you've seen videos of the Kotel, it's jam-packed with people praying for the rebuilding of the temple. It's something so moving. A lot of young people, like thousands and thousands and thousands of young people, just singing songs of redemption, of faith, of hope, of strength. And that the fact that we keep singing these songs is what's going to bring the redemption. It's going to bring the next phase, because as long as we're not satisfied with the status quo, we're going to be okay. And so you see this kind of paradox, this great longing, the great faith, a hope of a Israel rebuilt, yet not completely in the vision of the prophets, where there would be world peace, that there will be no more wars amongst the nations. It said, "Lo yisa gai el gai charev," no nation will engage in war with each other, and they won't best in war, and even the so-called lion will lie down with the lamb, that there will be world peace. And this is really what we're praying for. We can never let go of this vision. And so when we come the day after Tisha B'av, and Tisha B'av is this kind of paradoxical day, because as long as we're commemorating it, we know that we're not satisfied. And we were in shul, my husband said to me, say a few words about Tisha B'av as we finished reading the Eicha. And I said, what is there to say? I'll say the last line of Eicha. Ki im ma'os mastanu kafatzta aleinu ad ma'od. God, if you have punished us and you have been dissatisfied with us, okay, but it's already too much. Like, it's time for the redemption. It's time for better days. And so that's what we live with. And that's, so the good news is that when we turn the page of Tisha B'av, we are now headed towards the Shabbat called Shabbat Nachamu. The Shabbat Nachamu is called the Shabbos of comfort. And the Haftorah that we will be reading the Shabbos in Shul, it opens up with the words, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, Yomar Elekechem. Be comforted, my people, says your God. And then it speaks in the most poetic words. It says, Dabru alev Yerushalayim, speak to the heart of Jerusalem and comfort her. And it talks about the fact that Jerusalem will be comforted and be rebuilt. And so this is what we live with. And this is the paradox of Jewish life. Yesterday we cried for the temple, for the destruction, for suffering, for the suffering of the Jewish people, and for the current lack of peace and the current lack of health and the current lack of equity and everything that is wrong with our world. And today we are going towards hope and healing and belief that it will come. And that is what it means to be a Jew. We have to hold those two paradoxes at the same time. Now, this week's Torah portion is a Torah portion of the Vaetchanan. It is the second Torah portion in the book of Devarim. The book of Devarim, as we mentioned last week, is different than all the other books of the Torah in that while the first four books are written in God's voice, as it were, the book of Devarim is written in Moshe's voice. So that the book of Devarim is a book of the first four books are books of reception, where the Jewish people are hearing God's voice, and the Torah speaks by Yedaber Hashem El Moshe Lemor. God spoke to Moses saying, or God spoke to Abraham saying. And here we have the Torah in Moses' own words. In his own words, it's his last will and testament. And our sages say that the book of Bamidbar entire was said a month or so, a month and a half, 37 days before Moshe dies. And it's his last will and testament. And it's his expression of strengthening the Jewish people and helping them go through the new stage in their life, which is to enter and conquer the land of Israel and to establish a civilization in a country very different than what they had in the desert. But of course, the book of Vaetchanan begins very famously with the words of Moshe. Moshe is telling the Jewish people that God did not allow him to go into the promised land with them. Vaetchanan el Hashem, and he begged God. Vaetchanan is a language of true supplication, to truly supplicate. And he begged God, and Rashi points out, and Rashi usually doesn't engage in gematria, we find this in other commentaries, but Rashi points out that Vaetchanan has the gematria, has numerical value of 57, so that Moses begged God 57 times he begged God for 57 times to come into the land of Israel, and each time he was rebuffed by God. God did not allow him to go into the land of Israel. And then from there, from Moses' retelling of the fact that he could not go into the land of Israel and his begging of God that he can go into the land of Israel, the Torah goes into Moses' words to the Jewish people, giving them strength and giving them direction to go as they go into the land of Israel. And what this week's Torah portion actually consists of are ultimately becomes major center points in Jewish liturgy, major center points in Jewish thought. Namely, we have the 10 Commandments repeated in the words of Moshe himself. It's not the exact words of the 10 Commandments, but a summation, but it's very, very similar to the 10 Commandments as the Jewish people heard it on Mount Sinai. So he's telling the next generation the 10 Commandments. We have the prayer of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. We have the injunction of the Exodus of Egypt. We have the words that we use when we take out the Torah. V'zot HaTorah, Asher Sam Moshe Lifnei Bnei Yisrael is in this portion. And we also have a certain reference to the Haggadah itself, the questions that the child will ask you and you will tell them and so on. So we have great portions of tenets of faith in this week's Torah portion that really become central to Judaism. Now, the question that is brought up by the commentaries that the Rebbe attempts to ask and answer is this. If we look at the book of Devarim, the first section of the book of Devarim is a historical account of a summation of the historical account of the Jewish people's experiences in the desert. The book of Devarim, as we said, is the words of Moshe himself. Is the history in his own words, the Torah in Moshe's words. So as such, they have added strength because they are the words of Moshe, so more relatable to the Jewish people. But at the same time, it's not the word of God. And the commentators say that if you look at the book of Devarim, it's like a miniature Torah in that it's called Mishnah Torah. It's called the repetition of the Torah. And so it begins with the Torah portion of Devarim, which is also the book of Devarim. And then it goes on to the different teachings and the episodes of the book of Devarim. The second one is the one we're studying today, is Vaetchanan, and I beseech and I pray. And the question that is asked is this. In the first section, which we read last week, the book of Devarim, it kind of gives the whole historical, the kind of picture of what happened to the Jewish people in the desert. The book of Devarim is a review, and the history of that book seems to be tucked away in the first section. And so our sages say that in the book of Devarim, the first section is like the book of Bereshit. Bereshit is the history of the world and the history of the Jewish people before they're giving the receiving of the Torah. And the second section, the book of Vaetchanan, or rather the portion of Vaetchanan, is really is like the book of Exodus, where the bulk of the identity and the underpinnings of faith are found in the 10 Commandments and so on and so forth. So they compare the first section, which we read last week, they compare that section to the book of Bereshit, and our section this week to the book of Shemot, because it contains so many central tenets of our faith. So the Rebbe asked the question then, so where does the story of Moshe crying to God to be allowed, and this is something that's not happening now, but Moshe is recounting, Vaetchanan, and I did pray to God. I prayed to God to be allowed into the land of Israel. Why is this segment of history being included in a Torah portion otherwise devoted to theology, to basic tenets of Judaism? Why is this section of the story involved here? What's the connection? And the answer is actually very illuminating in terms of a greater mission and a greater truth to the whole story of the Jewish people going into the land of Israel. And it also solves, to a certain extent, the big question, the unanswerable question on a certain level of why Moses was not allowed to go into the land of Israel. I remember Ira once said, we were talking and she said, whatever, like all the excuses notwithstanding, Ira, remember, you don't understand, you can't understand how God could be so severe against Moshe and not allow him to go into the land of Israel.
I remember that.
Yes, right? It's a hard one. And truly, it's one that a lot of discussion has been set aside to that, and we have discussed it as well. Here, what the Rebbe is doing is he's going to connect the fact that this interesting piece of history is being included by Moshe in the section where he's teaching the Jewish people the main tenets of Jewish faith. The question is, what is the connection? So we're going to go into the verses in a minute, but I want to give you the overview. And this is this. Moshe is begging on behalf of himself to go and see the land of Israel. And God does not allow him to see the land of Israel. Okay, God does not permit him to see the land of Israel. Moshe is begging for it and God does not allow it. So we see here, and this is the Torah portion of this week. The Torah portion begins with the word Vaetchanan, and that is the name of the Torah portion, which means I entreated, I begged. And Moshe is telling the Jewish people, Vaetchanan el Hashem ba'isa lemor. I begged God during that time to saying, so this is what I said. Adonai Hashem, you have begun to show your servant, meaning Moshe, your greatness. And your great hand. There was no one like you, God, right? There's no power outside of you. So, God, you can make everything possible. I know you decreed that I should not go into the land of Israel. I know that was your decree. But you, God, can make anything possible. So therefore, God, I beg of you, I plead with you. Let me cross over and let me see this great, beautiful land. Asher be'aver hayarden, which is on the other side of the Jordan River, Hahar hatay, the good mountain, and the Lebanon. Now, our commentators say the Lebanon is the mountain where the Beit HaMikdash was built and so forth, and so therefore that when we talk about Lebanon, Rashi here says the Lebanon Beit HaMikdash, the Lebanon is the temple. Now the reason why the temple is called the Beit HaMikdash because the hills of Lebanon were considered to be very beautiful, and so this is the beautiful part of Israel is the mountain of Jerusalem. So Hahar Hatov Hazeh Zu Yerushalayim. She wanted to see the Jerusalem and the Beit HaMikdash. And he tells the Jewish people, however, despite my pleas, but God was angry with me because of you, and he did not listen to me. No, you're asking for too much. And don't bring up the subject again. You're asking for too much, and you cannot bring the subject up again. Don't ask me again. And our sages say the reason why God told Moses, don't ask me again, is because if Moses would have asked again, God would have had to listen to him. Okay, what if and so on.
What does the Rebbe say? I want to know how.
Yes, I'm going to explain this. So we're first going to get into what Moses is asking, and what the Rebbe explains is a very deep reason that connects why this section is included in a section that has so many of our teachings, and what connection does it have with the fact that Moshe does not go into the land of Israel. And I mentioned we have learned many different interpretations of why Moshe doesn't go into the land of Israel. And one of the things that I said in the past, and I think it's a good rule in general, when we have a question on the unanswerable questions of life, okay? Because at the end of the day, some things are really beyond the scope of our capacity to understand. So for example, yesterday we mourned the destruction of the temple. As I mentioned, we were talking about the Holocaust. And my husband and I were talking last night. We were saying, the Holocaust is actually unfathomable. It's one of those things that you can't fathom. First of all, you can't fathom how God allowed it. You can't fathom how human beings who are living in the 20th century could sink to such depravity. I was reading a book yesterday in the spirit of Tisha B'av. I was reading a book by a Holocaust survivor that's now out of print, and she has long passed. But she says this little girl who actually survived in the forest, and what made her so tenacious to run away was that she was at a friend's house. Her parents didn't have any money. She was at a friend's house, a Christian friend's house, and they were listening to the radio. And Hitler gave his speech, which they didn't understand because it was in German. It was a Polish town. And then the commentator repeated Hitler's words in Polish. And what he said was, that Hitler had said in that speech that if he sees, and this speech was made in 1937, I think, 1938, if he will see a Jew alive in 1944, he will salute him for the capacity to survive. And she was a young girl, and she heard this, and she didn't understand why her parents were not so alarmed with Hitler, but most Jews lived in villages and didn't really know what was happening, and they were unaware really of the great danger that was facing them. But when you hear that kind of rhetoric, and you hear this kind of talk, and you're saying to yourself, this was said to hundreds of thousands of people and repeated and known by millions. And how did people sing to this? And you read these accounts of children shot and trying to get some food, and a German, sniper sees them and feels so great, or a Ukrainian sniper, whichever nationality, all nationalities participated. No one has clean hands in Europe with the story of the Jewish people. What part of them did they have to put away to shoot a child who's getting food? It boggles the mind. So it's really one of these unfathomable questions. So I think in general, when we come to the unfathomable questions and the questions that we don't easily answer, the first premise is we don't really know. When we have the humility to say, I'll never understand this. Then when we try to look for answers, we first posit that we don't know, and then the answers that we have could be satisfactory. So Ira, before you say, what's the Rebbe's answer? I want to say this, that let's first say that we don't really know. But in that we don't know, we're going to find layers of truth that are going to shed light on greater truths, and that they will kind of lock with the truth and interlock with the truth, and then we'll understand it. We'll understand it on some level. So that's my I guess my caveat. Do we know the answer? Will it satisfy everyone? I don't know. I'm not here to say I have the big answers. It's one of those questions that we don't understand, but we can try to understand it on some level. So Moshe is called upon to God, and what does God give him? What is God's prize to Moshe? His small prize, his consolation prize. Alei Rosh Pisgah, go up to the Pisgah and to the mountain. And look east, west, north, south. And get a glimpse of the land, because that's all you're going to get is a glimpse. And then God tells him, V'tzaves Yeshua, and command Joshua, and give him strength and encourage him. He's going to be the one that is actually going to bring the Jewish people in. He's going to help them settle the land. So focus on strengthening Joshua and strengthening the generation. So right after the story, what does Moshe say? So Moshe tells them the story, a story that really belongs in the previous Torah portion by all accounts. And then he says, after he tells them, okay, I can't go into the land of Israel, he says, Va'ata Yisrael, and now Israel, Shma el hachukim ve'el hamishpatim asher anaychi milamed estem la'aseh. And now Israel, go listen carefully to all the laws and the commandments that I'm going to teach you. L'man tichyu uva'asem v'rishtem es ha'aretz, so that you can live and come into and inherit the land that God wants to give you. So right away, Moshe pivots from a story, and he goes straight into the notion of now listen carefully to what I'm going to teach you. And then we see that in this Torah portion, we have the Shema, which is, of course, the central prayer of Judaism. The Shema is a prayer of Hear, O Israel. And in the book of Devarim after this, and not in this Torah portion and the portion that follows and the portion that follows, we're going to see this notion of Shema repeated many, many times, not just in this Torah portion, but in the book of Devarim. And so Moshe pivots from wanting to go into the land of Israel to the Jewish people to immediately saying to them, okay, I can't go in, God didn't let me, so hear carefully, listen carefully. So the Rebbe asks the question, what's more impactful, to see something or is it to hear something? So of course we know that the answer is seeing is believing, that when we see something, we know for sure that whatever it is that we saw happened because we saw it with our own eyes. And when we hear something, we don't know for sure the complete veracity of it. And also we have to internalize it. So let's say when someone tries to describe something that they saw, they have to be very colorful to really transmit to the person who is listening the experience that they had. When someone sees something, there's no way that the person cannot unsee that. And so seeing is much more powerful, but seeing at the same time does not require a lot of effort. If you happen to see something, you saw it. And so what the Rebbe says is that when Moshe said, I want to go into the land of Israel and I want to see the land, what Moshe was telling God was, I want to come into the land of Israel and help these people see revelation and help these people see that which I see. Why? Because we know that the generation that went into the land of Israel is not the generation that came out of the Exodus. It's not the generation that came out of Egypt. It's not the generation that heard the 10 Commandments. Even though Moshe will tell them, you all heard this. When he says you all heard this, he means all of you, your souls heard this. And we say that even those who join the Jewish people in the future are at Sinai, but the actual generation, we know there was a law, a commandment that they would all die in the desert. So the actual generation does not make it into the land of Israel. So Moshe is very concerned. He has here a whole new generation of people born in a desert who don't remember the Exodus because they weren't there. And they have to believe that the Exodus happened to their forefathers. Now it's like a matter of faith. This is what happened to the previous generation. They were the generation of the Exodus. You know what happened? They saw God at Mount Sinai. They heard the 10 Commandments. So you have a new generation that didn't experience this. So Moses is very concerned for this generation. He's very concerned and he's very worried for this generation because he says,
I still don't understand the answer.
Yes,
Devorah,
I didn't get the answer yet. We're not there yet. We're building it. Okay. So Moshe basically wants to inculcate this new generation with the power of sight, meaning the power of visualization of truth that their forefathers experienced and that he experienced. So he felt that if he can see the land of Israel, if he can experience the land of Israel, meaning that he goes in with the Jewish people into the land of Israel, he can transmit to the Jewish people this higher level of knowing God, of knowing the truth, of knowing the history of the Jewish people, because it will be on the level of sight. It will be on the level of, Moshe said, I want to see the land of Israel. So the Rebbe says that what he's asking for is, I want to be able to experience Israel on a sight level, and then I will influence this new generation to also see God and see the mitzvot and see the injunction on a sight level. So it won't have to be something that they heard, a Baba Maisa, that they heard from their grandmother. It'll be something that they really experienced for themselves by having Moses, who was a witness to everything that happened, and the teacher, who was the actual teacher who got the 10 Commandments, who taught the revelation. Moshe was the one who was closest to God. We say that Moshe spoke to God. When he interacted with God, it was with the ease that we have conversations with people. And so he wanted to go with them, to give them that strength of sight, of knowing in a very certain way. And God says, no, it's not part of the plan. You cannot do that. And so what Moshe does then is that Moshe pivots. And the first thing he says, right after he tells the Jewish people that I cannot take you into the land of Israel, is, hear Israel, listen Israel. And then that motif is repeated over and over again throughout this book. And it becomes and included in the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, which is one of the teachings that Moshe tells the Jewish people in this week's Torah portion, which is the central part of the most important tenet, the most important prayer in the Jewish tradition, the Shema Yisrael, people say Shema Yisrael when we wake up, we say Shema Yisrael when we go to sleep. When a new baby is born, we say Shema Yisrael with the baby the night before the bris. We say Shema Yisrael with young children. Jews say Shema Yisrael when they're when they're ready to leave the world, when they come into the world. Jews said Shema Yisrael when they were going to be killed in the name of God. And for being a Jew, we find that the Jews in the concentration camp said Shema Yisrael before they died. So it is so much part of who we are. We know that during the Spanish Inquisition, Jews identified each other by saying Shema Yisrael. So Shema Yisrael becomes this like signature line that really identifies a Jew. And what we have is that the word Shema is part and parcel of this idea. So Moshe pivots from being able to go into the land of Israel to focusing on Shema, which is like second best. Okay, let me make them hear the Torah. Let me teach it into their ears so they should understand it. So then the Rebbe asked the question, so then how come not? If Moshe was so concerned that the Jewish people should maintain their theology and their devotion to God, and that he was concerned they're going to go into the land of Israel, and the land of Israel is going to have so many visual distractions, and it's going to be a materialistic life, and they'll see that if you don't plant, nothing grows, and that there is no, there's much less room for spirituality when you have to go about the business of doing your business. And so why not allow Moses to go into the land of Israel for that reason, so that we can ensure the continuity of the Jewish people, have Moses stay as long as possible, extend his life. And that this is what Moses is saying to God. God, I know that you're capable of anything, so certainly you're capable of allowing me to go into the land of Israel. And so the question that the Rebbe asks is, why not? Why not allow Moses to go into the land of Israel and kind of be this kind of light that they can take with them into the land of Israel to help them resist the temptation to fall prey to the common culture, which was idol worship and a very visually oriented religion. Judaism demands like a much more introspective, because we're not allowed to have images. So it demands introspection of what is God, who is God, what does God mean in my life, because it's all in the realm of the intangible. And so here the Rebbe brings a teaching about the impact of hearing over seeing. And this is what he says. He says that it's true that seeing is the highest level of witness. If you see something, you know it happened. But seeing is an outside stimuli that is, I guess, foisted on you because you see something. You just happen to have witnessed it. And so it's not something that comes from your own effort. If I open my eyes and I see something, what effort do I make in that sight? If God gives me eyes that can see, I can see it. So there's no effort. It is just a mechanism of my ability to see. And therefore, I have seen it. So in the realm of effort, seeing is really something imposed from the outside. It's an outside visualization that your body has the capacity to do, but it doesn't take any effort from the capacity. When it comes to hearing, and it's very interesting because in Yiddish, there is an expression in Yiddish that says aderher. Aderher means a deep thought. So often you'll see when Hasidim talk to each other, when they want to have a Torah thought, they'll say, no, give me a derher, give me a good hear. A derher means like something you can really tap myself into. So when we have the idea of hearing is something that is very true, is much less tangible. So when we hear something, what we have to do now is that we have to work a lot harder to process the information. I know that, so let's say we're listening to something. So sometimes we have to hear it again. So what did I just hear? Did I hear right? And did I misunderstand what the person who was telling me what they said? Did I understand what they said? So often you will listen again. And then what if your mind doesn't accept what the person says? So then there is this tremendous amount of work that a person has to do to kind of sort through this idea that they heard. And because it's coming from a much weaker energy, so to speak, it needs a lot more internalized work. And so when a person hears something, to truly understand it, they're going to have to ask questions. They may come back for more questions. They may want to hear it again. And there's going to be this back and forth. And they're going to have to flesh out the idea that they're hearing about and either reject it or ask enough questions so that they can accept it. So there's a lot more work involved in hearing. But the positive element of the work of hearing is that while seeing something is 100%, and hearing is a reduced version of that, when you see something, you could be lazy about the sight. In other words, yes, I saw this. And then actually, if you do not invest in what you saw, if time passes, certainly years or decades, you could become less sure of what you saw. Did I really see that? Maybe I never saw that. Maybe I saw something else. Why? Because we take for granted what we see, and unless we really work hard to internalize it, it stays in the realm of this outside stimuli. Whereas hearing, says the Rebbe, is not on the same level as seeing, but it requires a lot more work. And then, because that work is going to need to get done, the person will be left with something that is much more part of who they are, and not something that remains on the outside of who they are. So it becomes internalized in a much deeper fashion. And so we see in the Talmud that, which is very fascinating, that the Talmud, whenever it wants to present an idea and they want your attention, the Talmud says, Tashma, come here, come listen. Why? Come pay attention to this. In other words, can you understand what I'm saying here? This has to be, this has to be really internalized. And if you look at the Talmud and Jewish study in general, it's a tremendous back and forth and negotiation and discussion that needs a resolution, sometimes doesn't have a resolution. And so it's not a quiet, meditative experience. It's something that really requires a lot of effort and even noise. Like I mentioned many times, like if you ever step into Torah study hall, but the noise, the cacophony of noise is overwhelming. And that's because there's a lot of work that has to get done in trying to understand Torah that way. And so the Rebbe says as follows: if a people are going to go into the land of Israel, there's a limited time or a limited help that they can truly ride on the external inspiration that comes from having someone like Moses with them, the eyes of Moses, what Moses can see. There's a limited, and Moses cannot live forever, right? And he can't be the crutch for the Jewish people forever. So it's this limited experience that cannot endure. It's an inspirational moment. And after that, the work has to begin. The work has to begin in internalizing the message, because what will happen to the generation after that? And the generation after that? And the generation after that? The Torah was not written for the generation that came out of the Exodus. It was not written even for the generation that went into the land of Israel. What would happen to the grandchildren of those who went into the land of Israel? What would happen to the great-grandchildren? And what would happen to generations after that? There's a limit to how long you can take your Moses with you. And so what God said to Moses was, listen, if you go into the land of Israel, it's a temporary reprieve for a very deep problem, which is how do we inculcate Judaism into the consciousness of the Jewish people so that they maintain it for generations to come. And so God said to Moshe, no, you're going to have to teach the Jewish people in your own words. And they're going to have to listen, and they're going to have to debate it, and they're going to have to internalize it. And better you than someone else. Better you be the one who teaches them that which they have to hear and absorb and understand. And so we see that from that time on, the notion of Shema, come here, Tashma, come here and listen, is part and parcel of the Jewish identity. So we say, and when we say about even the exodus of Egypt, we say you should tell it to your children. You have to tell your children the exodus so they can hear it and they can absorb it and they can understand it. And this is true also for any kind of experience that we have. It has to become inculcated. And so it's interesting that the Talmud uses the expression tashma anytime he really wants to incorporate an idea or wants to really present an idea that people have to listen to. And the listening is not a blind obedience of hear and repeat, but rather it's something that has to become part of the person. And it takes a lot more effort, but because it takes a lot more effort, it's way more enduring. And so if Moshe would go into the land of Israel with the Jewish people, it would not ensure anymore that the Jewish people would have the reality of the tradition. Rather, by giving Moshe the opportunity to teach the Torah in his own words, and this is what he's doing in the book of Devarim. And who better than Moshe, right? To teach the Torah in his own words and to transmit in his own words to the next generation, something that they could not see, because they weren't at Sinai, something they did not experience because they weren't in the Exodus, but from hearing it, that they can ask the questions and they can internalize it and absorb it. This way, the Torah would remain truly inculcated in the Jewish people in a much greater fashion, so that if the mission is to have the eternity of the Jewish people, this was the best modality for it to happen. And the fact is that when Moshe does this now, and he gives us, instead of just being relaxed, so no to worry, I'm going to go with you into the land of Israel, we'll figure it out then. What Moshe does is that he gives his whole heart and his whole soul and everything that he knows and everything that he feels into this generation, and he does spend the time to teach them and to ask them the questions and to have them ask the questions so that they internalize this idea. And the Rebbe says, Kabbalistically, if you look at the Kabbalistic notion of the purpose of creation, the Kabbalistic notion of why we have a world, why does God put us on this world? Why do we go through life? Why are we meant to go through this thing called life, which involves so much pleasure, but also a lot of pain and disappointment? Why are we on this earth? And the answer that the Kabbalah gives us is that the purpose of creation, and the purpose specifically of human creation, and within the human creation, the creation of this notion of a Jewish people that would try to fulfill the mandate of God, is that we transform our surroundings and we transform our world in a way that it becomes a receptacle for divinity. And then we will have achieved the purpose of creation. And so as long as we don't have a transformative effect on the world, we haven't really achieved the purpose of creation. So everything that we have to do has to be in a way that transforms ourselves and then transforms the world. And so by Moses being the one who is best suited to give the Jewish people the tools to internalize this message, and thereby giving them the tools to transmit that internalization to the next generation, to the generation afterwards, this is in keeping with what really God wants from the Jewish people and what God wants from the world, and the mission of Moshe himself, why he was born, why he was brought into this world. And he was not brought into this world to bring the Jewish people into the land of Israel, but he was brought into this world to give the Jewish people everything they needed so that they can go themselves into the land of Israel. And that was the mission of Moshe, and he accomplished it in a phenomenal way. And the proof positive, as we mentioned this many times, is that we're studying Torah today, and we're studying the words of Moshe, and they mean something to us. And as much as we're not perfect, and as much as we are all projects in progression, and we spend our whole life trying to become more connected to our souls and to our purpose in this world and to divinity, we are still engaged in it. And the fact that this goes on is incredible. And I would say, that the fact that this goes on after this devastation that we commemorated yesterday, the devastation of the destruction of the temple, the tremendous calamities that befall the Jewish people throughout history, and more recently, the devastation that befell, European Jewry in the 20th century, this devastation called the Holocaust. That how could we withstand all of this if we did not internalize the Torah, and we did not have the tools to internalize the Torah without someone holding our hand? Because, when we talk about the darkness that befalls the Jewish people, or sometimes in a person's own private life, we all go through stages where we have open and revealed good, where we feel there's a blessing of abundance coming from God, and there are times that we feel like we're not in that sphere of sunshine, so to speak, and we feel a little lost with God. So the rabbis call this Hester Panim. The rabbis call this like the hiding of the face. And the fact is that the majority of time that the Jewish people have spent have been more with the hiding of the face than with the revelation. Now, there are times personally in our own personal lives where we feel the bountiness of blessing, and we feel revelation. And also as a people, there are times where we can literally point to an event and say, Zekeli Vanveru, this is my God, and I will laud him. For example, the miracle at Entebbe, when the Jews were rescued, you look at that and you go, wow, that's a miracle. Or the 6-Day War, where against all odds, the Jews took out, on the brink of destruction, the Jews took out all the armies and liberated Jerusalem. These things are not supposed to happen usually. They don't happen usually. And we always ask, where are the miracles of the Bible today? The nature of Galut is that we don't see God. So how do we survive this? How do we survive the not seeing God? And the tools for that not seeing has been given to us by Moses, because Moses did not take the easy route of saying, I'll be with them a little longer so they can see a little longer. But rather, with the desperation that he had to have to know that there was no way he can go into the land, he had to give it all he had to truly inculcate into the Jewish people this message of internalizing the Shema, of internalizing the hearing of what Judaism is about. And without it, he would not have had the pressure to really inculcate, and perhaps it would have been a generation that was inspired, that generation, the generation afterwards, and then the Torah may have been lost forever. But because Moses could not come into the land of Israel, and he did not want this project to fail, he had to take everything he had and everything he knew and everything he had internalized, and in turn help the Jewish people internalize it. And so even though that meant it was a privilege that Moshe could not have, nevertheless, and you could say that there's an unfairness there, nevertheless, what Moshe achieved by this not having was far more than he could ever have achieved with the complacency of knowing that everything is okay, I'm with them, and so on and so forth. It's like when you send your kids off to camp for the first time and you try to inculcate their safety and their self-esteem and so on and so forth, that you know that you're not going to be there for them. And there you actually make your children grow up a little bit. But if you always take your child with you and you helicopter parents until they're 18, then when they have to leave the house, they're birds that have no wings, And so we have to let our children, and yes, before we allow our children, and so therefore Moses is our father, our teacher, and this is where he becomes truly Moshe Rabbeinu. This is when Moshe morphs into Moshe Rabbeinu. And I saw a beautiful teaching this week from Sivan Rahav Meir, who's a journalist in Israel who gives a phenomenal Torah class and different Torah insights. She's a wonderful personality, a great journalist, and truly a person who thinks about Torah all the time. And she said something that I thought was so beautiful. She says that, remember Moses, when he first was brought to God, and God wanted him to save the Jewish people, he said, Ani aral sfasayim, I cannot speak, God. I cannot express myself well. Shlachna b'yad tishlach, send someone else who's endowed with the gift of expression. I can't speak. So why are you asking me to teach a people and to lead, to speak to Pharaoh and then to teach a people? I'm not a man of words. Lo ish devarim anochi, I'm not a man of words. And here we open up a book called Eila Devarim. These are the words that Moses put in front of the Jewish people. Suddenly, Moses became, not overnight, a man of words. So a whole book called Words. Which words? The words of Moshe. The words of a person who became a teacher by the fact that he had no choice, that he could not just stay there with them and hold their hand and his face is shining, but rather he had to give them the tools to be their own little Moshe. And the Rebbe says that a prayer of a tzaddik never goes to waste. And what Moses wanted very much, and the reason why he wanted to go into the land of Israel, was to help the Jewish people. Says the Rebbe, a Jewish leader does not see things in selfish terms. It's not because Moses wanted to be in the land of Israel for a personal reason. No, that was never part of the agenda. He's a Jewish leader, a true Jewish leader. He's the epitome of Jew, not because all Jewish leaders fall into this river, but the epitome of Jewish leadership. In other words, the model of Jewish leadership, which is what's good for the Jewish people. And so Moshe wanted to go into the land of Israel to help the Jewish people. And God said to him, you're going to help them more if you don't go into the land of Israel. And so the Rebbe says that a prayer of a tzaddik never goes to waste. So that Moshe wanted the Jewish people to see what he could see. So in that realm, the Rebbe says that God granted the ability for every Jew on some level to see what Moses could see, because his prayer did not go completely unanswered. So on that level, we all have inspiration that lies within us. And that inspiration could be drawn out, the inspiration of seeing that even though most of the work that we have to do is through the tashma, to come and hear, that we do also have kind of by blessing, through the prayer of Moses, we also have the ability to see. And that ability is something that is ingrained deep in our consciousness. And so that our sages say that there's a heavenly voice that calls every single day to the human being to become a better person. And that heavenly voice is heard by us on some level. And so that it gives us the energy to turn to the work that we have to do, which is the work of tashma, to come and hear and to come and internalize and to come make Judaism and the mission of Judaism and the teachings of Judaism, of kindness, of charity, of care, of morality. We have to inculcate that into this ourselves. And so therefore we can really become transmitters for the next generation, who again will have to do the work of tashma. And so that is why the most important prayer of the Jewish people is not see, O Israel, but hear, O Israel. Because ultimately for us to endure as a people, we have to really empower and galvanize and strengthen this element of internalizing the message through the lower level of hearing. And although it begins as a lower level, it ultimately becomes a much more enduring level, because it has to tap in to a fullness of our consciousness in a way that having seen something would never do. So that is the teaching of the Rebbe on this week's Torah portion, I thought was so beautiful. And I was thinking to myself that who better understands a Moshe than a Rebbe? So Moshe says, when the Rebbe says that Moshe did not go into the land of Israel because it would have been more effective for the Jewish people not to have him there. Who understands this better than a person who himself is dedicated to the Jewish people? You know, it takes one to know one. So I think it's a very powerful message. And then again, it shows what a Rebbe is. It's like a parent. You know, sometimes you know that it's better for your child that you don't go with them to something very beautiful that you would love to see. But you know that it's better for them to see it themselves, because it will make them stronger or whatever it is. And that is part of being from that perspective of having to care for the next generation. So that's true if we are a teacher, it's true if we're a parent, it's true if we're a teacher of Judaism, it's true if we're a friend. This idea of being someone that can help another inculcate is not limited to any specific area in life. We all need it on some level, and sometimes the friend that we have to influence is ourselves. You know, the friend inside of us, this little person inside of us that we have to talk to, and that we have to teach, and that we have to inspire, and that we have to let inculcate is ourselves, the little person inside of us. So that is a beautiful teaching, and I think it's a teaching that is filled with hope because it means that we don't have to be so great. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be a Moshe Rabbeinu. We don't have to be someone that does everything right to have the opportunity to work on ourselves, work on our connection to God, work on our connection to our Judaism, work on our ethical connection to our soul, work on our kindness, work on our generosity, work on our empathy, all the things that we're enjoined to do in the 10 Commandments that God says to the Jewish people in Shemot, that Moshe repeats this week to the Jewish people. We all have that capacity to do it because it doesn't take vision. So if you say, I don't see this, I don't see this, don't worry, you don't have to see it. You have to plow through it. Look at the sages of the Talmud. They plowed and plowed and plowed. They didn't always have the answer. They didn't always know where the answer was headed, but they tried. And that is really what we're really empowered by, is the ability to really internalize the Torah and make it our own. And the one who makes it possible for us is Moshe, by the fact that he doesn't push God to say, let me go into the land of Israel, but rather channels all his energies to ascertain that the generation that will go into the land has all the tools that they need. And what better person to teach them those tools than Moshe himself, who saw everything. So a beautiful lesson. Yes, but now you can go and ask your question.
Yeah, it's wonderful, but still, can you recap in 2 sentences the difference between seeing and hearing?
Okay, so
sorry, and you mentioned something that repeats in the Torah, says very often the word hearing, like hear something you said. Just slowly, but repeat, because I'm a little bit slow. I speak fast, but I understand very slow.
Yeah, so Ira always says to me, Devorah, speak slow so I understand fast. Okay, so I'll try to speak slow so you understand that.
Yeah.
So when you see something, it doesn't take much effort. Well, obviously that's if you have 20/20 vision. But even if you don't, so you put on your glasses, how much effort does that take? You see. A vision comes from the capacity of the body to see. And so if it's there, it's there. There's no effort that has to be. There's no effort. It's an external thing that's presented to you. If you watch a movie or if you see two people fighting, you saw it. You don't have to say, what am I seeing? What am I seeing? You see something. You see something in front of you. But when you hear, then you have to really slow down. Like you see proof positive. You heard, and I have to explain it again. Yes, this is the proof positive. When you hear something, you have to work harder.
You have to process.
You have to work hard to process. And then you may not accept what you heard. You may say, 1 second, but this doesn't make sense to me. And then you'll have to hash it out. Sometimes you'll have to say, what do you mean by this? And you'll have to be explained. Or it's something that you want to chew over. You say, I don't accept this quite. And then you may chew it over and disregard it and say, no, I don't accept this. Or I accept this on some level, but I can't accept this on this level. So what you're doing actually is you're doing a lot of work. Whatever you're left with is yours because it came through your work. I could tell you something, but it's like, you can lead the horse to the water, but the horse has to drink, right? So I could tell you something. I'm not imposing it on you. I'm presenting it to you. Now you have to really work very hard to internalize it. Whereas seeing, if you see someone fall down, what do you have to internalize? You saw.
So how does it connect to Moses?
So Moses was on the level of seeing. In other words, seeing is
he wanted to see.
So he wanted to see, but also he epitomized seeing because he had the ability to see God in a way that we don't. So what Moses wanted to see, the land, what he wanted to do was be with the Jewish people so they could have a seer, so to speak. They could have someone that sees for them or that gives them the capacity to see or helps them see.
Okay.
But that seeing is only good as long as you're looking at it. In other words, I see something, and as long as I see it, I see it. If it's taken away from me with time, unless I work very hard, which we don't, because seeing doesn't demand it from us. What we do ultimately is that we either see it or we don't see it. But if we see it, unless we internalize it, which it doesn't demand, we can actually forget what we saw. Or you can forget what a person looks like, even though you saw them, because if you only see them once, that's where photographs are very good. Photographs help us remember things that we saw because it recharges the initial memory of the scene. So seeing is a powerful thing because you can't deny that which you see, but it is only there as long as you're seeing it. If you're a people, I saw yesterday the former mayor of Jerusalem, Nir Barakat, posted a video of the people singing at the Kotel, in a moving way, and he writes in Hebrew. I guess it's a famous a saying in Israel today. Am hanetzach lo mifached miderech aroch, something to that effect. That an eternal people are not intimidated by a long path.
Interesting.
And he wrote that, in other words, like the Beit HaMikdash is not built, but we're not intimidated. We still sing. So I thought it was such a beautiful teaching. Am hanetzach lo mifached miderech aroch. Like an eternal people is not afraid of a long path. And this is really what Moshe was saying. And what God was basically intuiting to Moshe, that the work has to get done because the path is very long. If the Jewish people will have the crutch of seeing, which is epitomized by Moshe. Moshe's seeing, and Moshe is the ability for them to see what happened. They will never internalize, and they will never do the hard work of internalizing the hearing, which is on a much lower level. Hearing demands, you're proof positive, Ira. Hearing demands that we actually incorporate what we heard to understand it on our level, and then sometimes we will accept it or reject it or modify it, mull over it, come back to it. And then with time, that idea and that notion becomes something that we understand as part of ourselves, and then becomes part of who we are. And then when it's really worked out really well, try to disabuse a person of an idea that they really worked through. If someone
Devorah, it also empowered future generations to do the oral Torah.
Absolutely. The oral Torah is definitely the idea of hearing. And the capacity to hear. But when we have this, when a person really works through an idea, and you try to say to them, your idea doesn't make any sense. You go, what are you talking about? I didn't think about this yesterday. This is something I've been researching for years. I've been thinking about for years. You're not going to easily convince me out of it because this is something I put a lot of time. I put a lot of thought into this. I thought of the pros and the cons. I thought of the arguments on all sides. And this is what I came up with. It's not so easily uprooted. So this is
according to sages. How did Moses accept it that God didn't let him in?
So according to the Rebbe's teaching here, what Moses sees is that ultimately, although he would have more enjoyment to go into the land of Israel, it wouldn't be for the benefit of the eternity of the Jewish people. Maybe it would be for that generation, but not for the eternity of the Jewish people. In other words, when you go into a land, you have to toughen up, and you can't have your crutches because you're going to be dealing with a lot of visual stimulation
So you have to teach them.
that is going to discount. You have to really have internalized the work. And that is why, by the way, we have the mitzvah of to study Torah or to pray. Why do we have these things? It's because we have to keep going back to the trough and drinking from the well and chewing over ideas and accepting or not accepting. Listen, we say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, these and these are the words of a living God. Shivim panim laTorah, there's 70 faces to the Torah. What does this mean? It means that there's a lot of paths that a person can take to the information, because a person sometimes is more experiential, more logical, deductive, whatever it is that a person experiences and how a person comes to ideas. That's what we have to do. So we have to go back to it and go back to it. And this actually is what strengthens the Jewish people. And actually, parenthetically, I was talking at the beginning of the class about the burning of the Talmud. The burning of the Talmud that happened in the south of France. The south of France was a tremendous area of Jewish learning and growth. So much so that some of the teachings we see that for example, even something like a food on Shabbos that we eat, cholent, you know, we still have the language of the South of Fest, sholom, like we cooks, you know, slow cook, right? That's what cholent is. We even have that as part of our, cholent is like a, you know, it's a word that is like, it means food, but it comes from French, sholom, and it comes from the fact that the halacha was really very vibrant in the south of France. But once the books of Talmud were burned there and they had nothing to study from, you know that they left and they had to find places where there was a Talmud, and it ended a beautiful time in history where there was a tremendous academies and studying, and it stopped. And this is true also in Italy. We see that in Italy, there's a time when there's an Italian Jewish Renaissance in study, and then it kind of peters out. Why? Because the yeshivas were banned, and once the yeshivas were banned, the study was not there, we lose it. Because every generation has to internalize Judaism. Every generation has to ask, what does this mean to me? How do I understand this? How does it relate to my life? How can I apply it to my life? And if we don't have that, and if we only do it because, you know, my bubby did it, my zaidi did it, tradition, it's good, it's nice, it's sweet, but we're left with a little gefilte fish and a good chicken with matzo balls and nice feelings, but it's on such a superficial level. If we want to internalize it, we have to do the work. And what Moses, so the answer from the Rebbe on this one, and I've heard multiple answers from the Rebbe on the idea of why Moses didn't go into the land of Israel, but here what the Rebbe is saying is Moses himself understood that although it would be for his own pleasure to go into the land of Israel, it was not for the benefit of the generation that had to go in. And a leader always looks for the benefit of the generation and not for his own pleasure.
Devorah,
Other question, just a couple of small points, two little points. Devorah, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, one is maybe I heard wrong. I'm thinking of what I heard when you said that Vaetchanan was 57 gematria, but isn't it 515?
Oh, there you go. You see, post-fast.
I don't know. I could have heard wrong, but
no, I appreciate the correction, and I stand.
I didn't understand the question.
Corrected.
What was the question?
That Vaetchanan, the gematria is higher than 50. I knew it was a 5. Thank you. You know, I appreciate that. It is, I stand corrected. I did not do the math. I did not sit and do the math.
Okay, no, I just, because I know I always hear, you know, he prayed 515 times, 5/5. I just want to
appreciate that.
If I heard right. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, that I sit corrected.
Okay, the second point was thank you for the watermelon tip. It really helped with my fast yesterday.
Well, someone once told it to me, and I found that I didn't have a headache the next day.
Yeah, well, I went off caffeine for a week. That I did. But I mean, but the watermelon, it's sort of, I felt like it stayed within me the whole day. I think the water remained, although
the reason why someone told this to me once, and I tried it, and I found that watermelon is something really good to have before a fast. And the reason they say is that watermelon is like Gatorade, it's like Powerade, but without the bad sugar. Right. Unnatural sugar. It's a natural sugar. It has all the electrolytes.
Right.
Also vitamin C and different things, but it has all the electrolytes that the body needs to function. And what makes us get a headache is when we have dehydration. Dehydration is an imbalance of electrolytes sometimes. And so having watermelon is, first of all, you get the water. You actually, watermelon is full of water. That's why it's so heavy. But it also, more importantly, it has the electrolytes. I know some people take Gatorade before a fast. They say it helps them because they put in magnesium and different potassium and salts. And watermelon has sugar, salts, potassium, magnesium, all the basic electrolytes that you need to go through a fast. So, and it's tasty and it's fresh, and it's also good for after fast to revive us.
Yeah, you should have sent.
So it should be the last fast that we have to fast the Tisha B'av. We say this every year. Amen. But we have to keep saying it, because if we do not believe in a better tomorrow, we can't be. We are not a people of only. We are a people of history. We're not only a people of history. We're a people of history, and we're a people of the present, and we're also a people of the future, and a people of hope. Of great hope for a future, and that is what galvanizes us. We know that the world will become a better place. This is the plan, and to the extent that we can make it happen quicker, we have to do that. But prayer, certainly asking God, like I said, the last line of Eicha, if you have really not liked us, you really have You've done your duty, God, with your disappointments. From now on, we pray only open and reveal good and revelation in every element of our lives, in our personal lives, in personal health, in family health, in blessing for the people that we love, for our community, unity within our community, and ultimately unity throughout the world, and the end and the cessation of wars. And unfortunately, we don't see that happening right away. We always hope, and we know that it will happen. I saw someone yesterday said, we don't pray for peace, we get ready for war. It's true that right now Israel has no choice. And when you have people who want to destroy your people, you have to do war. But it's not something that we have to celebrate. It's actually a painful aspect of life, is that we have to fight. Yes, if someone wants to kill us, we fight. But that's not what we celebrate. We do it. It's just like you have to take up the garbage. You don't celebrate that you have to take up the garbage. You just have to take up the garbage. But what we really want to celebrate is a time when there will be true peace, a peace that comes from a recognition that all of us are created in the image of God, and that to take a life is to really destroy the image of God, and a reverence for our life, and then a reverence for everything else will follow. And so may that happen very soon. May this indeed be the last
Amen.
the Jewish people have to
Amen.
commemorate. And may we go to times of blessing and peace and tranquility and open and revealed good, and everything that the prophets say, like the very famous story of Akiva, who was crying on the Temple Mount, and then his friends were crying on the Temple Mount. He was laughing. And why was he laughing? And they said they thought he lost his mind. They said, Akiva, why are you laughing? And he said, I see that everything that the prophets prophesied about the destruction of the temple happens. So I'm laughing because I know their prophecies are true. And if their prophecies are true in the negative, it will be in the positive. And therefore, I'm laughing because I see the Beit HaMikdash will once again be redeemed and revealed and rebuilt. And they were crying because they saw foxes walking on the Temple Mount. And you know what? Shualim. And today we still have foxes walking on the Temple Mount. And we pray to God that God should also take away that desecration of the Temple Mount and return it to what it is. It's supposed to be a house of healing, a house of prayer, a house of peace for the whole world. Ki beiti beit tefillah yikari l'chol ha'amim, because my house will be a house of prayer for all the nations of the world. And it will be a place of peace offerings and of brotherhood and kinship. And may that time happen very soon. And we should not be satisfied until it happens.
Devorah,
it's very nice to start a week with your very optimistic.
it really is.
It's not my optimism. This is their Torah.
I'm much smarter.
I'm only sharing the things that I'm learning, and it's not my idea. If it was my ideas, we would not be in a good place.
Devorah, before you go, I'm sorry. There was in passing, you mentioned that in Torah very often it appears the word listen.
Yes.
And I mean that word.
Shema. In the book of Devarim, we
Yeah.
have first here, right after Moses says, I could not go into the land of Israel.
Yeah.
He right away pivots and he says, Shema. Listen.
So you don't know, you said it often appears the word listen.
Yes, and after that we have in the book of Devarim, Shema, 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 Shema.
Why
It's the
Shema?
language that Moshe is using to the Jewish people over and over again, and to the point that when he says the verse, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad,
That's what it is. I got it. Yeah.
It becomes that's the central part of
that's the importance of listening.
He uses it. Now it doesn't mean that he doesn't use the word re'eh. He does use the word re'eh, but Shema.
What is re'eh? What is re'eh?
See.
What?
See.
To see.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So now I'm going to apparently
that's why the most
okay.
I got it.
Now I'm going to address the questions that are in the chat.
Just one thing I wanted to add is that hearing expands the imagination, and so if we in the Holocaust could imagine coming out or being saved, or if we could imagine a third temple, that's much more powerful. It's the difference between reading a book and reading a comic book.
Yes, absolutely. So absolutely, again, the internalization of the idea into the way we understand it. Sometimes, you read a book and the book is very moving, and you have this notion of the book, and then there's a movie that comes out about the book, and then you read the movie, you're so disappointed because in your mind, the book was so much more powerful because it allowed you to color the story. Here, it's actually limited by the imagination of someone else or by the presentation of that material in a physical realm. I remember when I was a kid, I went to camp, and my kids went to camp. I sent them to the same camp that I went to. And I remember the first time visiting day, I had not been in the camp for many years, and I was very excited to see my old alma mater and my old stomping grounds. And I came into the camp and I said, wow, the camp is so small. I thought this field was so big. I thought the hill was like a big mountain. And I'm like, what's wrong with me? What was I thinking? But in my mind, where we had roll call in the morning when we did the flagpole, it was a huge space. And the mountain was a mountain. It was a hill. It was like a hill. And, so what we see, in our imagination, we can create things that are a lot greater than what we see. True. But it also becomes something that's much more internalized. And so, yes, I think that's why we have the idea of Shema so much in Torah. So the question is, someone said, could we answer some of the questions? Is there any specific questions that you want me to answer? Because there's so many. So I'm going to take.
Can you just go over why Shabbat Nachamu is so important?
Okay, so Shabbat Nachamu is the Shabbat called the Shabbat of comfort. It's very important because we pivot away from 3 weeks of mourning, 3 weeks of remembering devastation. We pivot away from that historical truth to something in the future. So why is it so important? It's because it gives us, first of all, the assurance, the faith, the hope that it will get better. And for a people that is an ancient people like the Jewish people that have endured so much, how could we survive? Again, I was saying that, how can we survive without having had that vision? I told you, I was reading this memoir of this Holocaust survivor, this young woman who was really running in the forest, and saving herself, pretending to be some crazy lost kid. And she says that when they were in the ghetto, and her parents' house became a house, that's what they did. They would liquidate. I hate that word. They would liquidate a certain part of the ghetto, and then they would go to different towns, and they would bring in more people into the ghetto. They were very organized, Yimach Shemam, they were very organized. So she said that the people, every so often, a new fresh of refugees would come into the ghetto, and her parents at one point had a nice house. And so because their house was larger, their house was filled with people. And she said she remembers the people would sing, Wir wollen sie überleben. I don't know the song. Wir wollen sie überleben. We will outlive them. And she said she knew it wasn't true. She knew it was absolute foolhardiness. She was the one who had heard Hitler's speeches on the radio. Her parents didn't have a radio. She didn't believe that most people would survive. And she said she thought it was naive that they were singing the song, but I don't think it was naive. I don't think it was naive when Jews were singing in the ghettos, Wir wollen sie überleben. We are going to outlive them. They meant not that they personally would outlive them, but that the Jewish people would outlive them. And so we need to have that element of the prophecies that are part and parcel, just the prophecies of gloom and doom, which unfortunately happened. The prophecies of hope, of a better future, it's really the water, it's the dew that sustains the Jewish people. Like even the national anthem of Israel is called Hatikvah. It's the faith, it's the hope. How could we endure without it? So it's very vivifying. It really empowers us to go forward. Because how could we go out of this period of mourning, which is so heavy, so laden with tragedy, and walk into a world today, Monday, that is a crazy world, a world that's full of strife and war and lies and deceit and hate and sickness. So how do we manage to go forward and build and to learn and to work for a better tomorrow? It is these prophecies that are really the succor and the healing and the sweetness of Judaism. And so they're very important because they bolster us and they give us the strength to go on. And like the Jews in the ghetto, when they were singing, we will outlive them. We know that this will happen, if not for ourselves, then for our children, if not for our children, our grandchildren. But we believe in this, in this internal message. Like I said, Nir Barakat, previous mayor of Israel, he wrote, Am hanetzach lo mefachad miderech aruka. We're not afraid of the long path. But the reason we're not afraid of the long path is because we have the proverbial, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's not fantasy. It's something that we are working towards, and the world will go towards. There's no doubt about it. It's a prophecy. A prophecy is not a wish. It's not a bracha. It's not a blessing. It's not may this happen. It's this will happen. And the prophets saw this with clear eyes. They said there will be a time that the world will be healed, and it will happen. And that is why Akiva laughed, because he said that whatever they said happened in the past, and what will happen in the future will indeed happen. And this will be something that will empower us to go forward and to give us the strength to deal head on with the challenges that we face. Because if we think that this is a cul-de-sac and there's no way forward, the Jewish people can't continue. But when we know that there will be, and it's not a matter of just hope, wishful thinking, blessing, but it's a matter of prophecy, meaning that it's something that's promised to us. That changes everything for us, and it gives us the power to go on. And that is the pain and the beauty of being Jewish, that we can go through this 3-week period, which I hate. I don't like this 3-week period, and go towards a better period, even though when we are in this 3-week period, it's very important that we're very mindful and very engaged in it, so that the restrictions that the rabbis place on us for the 9th of Av are they're modalities for us to understand what we lost and what we need to fight for, so that you can't have the joy without the pain.
What is that for the, what's that for, Luda?
Sushi.
Oh, that's sushi, okay.
Mm-hmm. So we can't just have the pain but we do have to go there. We have to go into the books, and we have to read, and we do have to shed a tear, and we have to cry. And so therefore we do read things that will move us to understand that the darkness of this world, and there's a moment to be dark, and there's a moment to be very, very mindful and even bitter about the length of the suffering. And we have to be there. We have to go into that, and we have to be there fully and completely, because being in that space actually makes us understand what we have to fight for, because it's not Pollyannish. It's not that we are just optimistic because we want to be optimistic. No, when we read the Eicha and we read the horrific description of the Eicha, we cry. And when we read the lamentations for the Jews in the Crusades, or the Jews in the Holocaust, or the Jews that had the Talmud burned, or any other moments that we enmesh ourselves to really feel the pain of what our people endured, and the lack of God's blessing, and the lack of the overall seeing the good. We have to go there, and we have to understand the depravity that human beings are capable of, so that we know what we're fighting for, which is we can't go back there. We have to go forward. And even though there are bumps along the way, and we think we're doing better, then we have something worse come along. Look at the Holocaust itself. I think in the history of the Jewish people, outside of the destruction of the temple, where millions were also killed, there's nothing that compares. And it happened so long after the destruction of the temple, and it happened at a time post the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about post-emancipation, you're talking about the Enlightenment. We're talking about people who are sophisticated and cultured, who appreciate music and who appreciate the finer things in life. Okay, the barbarians of old, what did they understand? They were undeveloped people. But we're talking about in the 20th centuries, people who were really in the leaders of science and technology and philosophy and psychology and music and art and poetry and everything that is really beautiful about the human being and refined about the human being, and then to just shut that all down and to become more morally depraved than the most barbaric of barbarians. How is that even possible? So we understand the danger and we understand the significance of what we endured, and we have to live it. And that's what Tisha B'av is. We sit on a low stool, we're not comfortable, we fast, we read things that are wrenching and they're hurtful, and we don't want to go there, but we have to be in it. We have to be mindful of the pain, and we do our duty, and then we come out of it saying, no, we need a better world. We need to change this. So there's an impetus from the bitterness that we get a renewed desire for a better world from the pain, not from the prophecy. The prophecy can only mean something to us if we understand the pain. So actually, Tisha B'av is, in a certain way, very cathartic in that it makes us, the bitterness of that day makes us really dig deep to understand that we can't go status quo, that we have to keep hoping. But the beauty of what follows and the Shabbos Nachamu is that we can be very sad and we can be bitter, but we don't get depressed. Depressed means that we can't move. Depression is a lack of vitality. We lay in bed and we don't want to get out of bed. So what the Torah lifestyle does to us is it takes us and it puts us in pain, and it makes us face the pain, and it makes us face the depravity of what human beings can be, and the lack of goodness that can be, and we're enmeshed in it. But then it also tells us that you don't wallow in this with a frozen depression, like don't worry, because feel this, but know you're going towards something better. So it literally schleps us out of the despair to be more active and say it will be better. But what can we do to make it happen faster? Because we're promised that it will be better. And when we know this in our kishkes, and we see part of those promises have already occurred. Specifically, the promise that the streets of Jerusalem will be alive again. This is happening already. We need the next part of the promises, which would be there'll be no more war, there'll be no more illness, there'll be no more strife, that there will be a house that will bring the whole world together. It's not the UN. We know that.
Oh, no.
The UN has become the biggest hypocrites of everything.
It's the biggest joke on earth.
Unfortunately, and it was a good idea. It was a good idea, but it's not.
In the beginning.
It was a good idea, but it's not turning out to be what we want it to be. And so it needs to be something that comes from much more work. It has to be internalized, and it cannot be just a name only. And then when we do that, hopefully we will get there. So I think Shabbos Nachamu, the import of it is to know that despite everything, and we have to be in the everything, we don't stay in it. We don't wallow. We don't have to be depressed. We could be sad. And by the way, there's a very big difference between sadness and bitterness and brokenness and depressed, because all those things are searing. You feel pain. It's hurtful. And a searing pain wakes us up to what has to be fixed. A depression numbs us and doesn't allow us to move forward. So the Shabbos Nachamu is the antidote, so that if our sadness and our pain and our bitterness even does not become a morass that we fall into, and it does not become something that paralyzes us and that makes us numb. Because if that is the outcome of Tisha B'av, then we haven't accomplished anything. So the Nachamu is the way it allows us to feel the pain, but go into a direction of translating the pain into action. And it's not about being just hopeful. It's really about being practical, to say we have to be aware of the evil. And the rabbis want us to be aware of the evil. This is why we read all these things. It's hard to read some of the things that we have to read, how mothers cook their children. It's really, it's good we don't eat it, we make you throw up.
Devorah,
Yeah.
For me, Tisha B'av blurs the distance between me and my God. because I start to sense that his pain is much greater than mine.
Yes, yes.
And
Okay, so-
than
yes.
ours.
I'm going to take 2 more minutes to answer some of the questions. Someone asked, where can we read all the prophecies? These are found in the book of Tanakh. So Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu, Yecheskel, those are the prophecies. Someone recommended a Holocaust memoir by Mark Eisen and wanted to see the Sea of War. Thank you for that. Then let me see. Why did Moses ask so many times to enter the land of Israel? Because, like I said, first of all, on a personal level, who doesn't want to go to Israel? But on a deeper level, he thought first that this would be something that would help internalize the Jewish people. And God said, no, it won't. So that's when he gave up and he said, we'll have to hear. Could Moshe not do this when he was in Israel? Good question. I think that the desperation that Moshe felt, his inability to go into the land of Israel, probably channeled all his desire to be in Israel, to lead the Jewish people into Israel, into empowering them to do that on their own. Did Moshe have feelings of sad or angry? Well, Moshe was a human being. He wasn't an angel. Of course, Moshe had feelings. Which human being doesn't have feelings? Of course, this is something that people tend to do with our great rabbis and our teachers. Sometimes they want to almost humanize them, that they're not capable of becoming sad or angry or frustrated or pained, and they're human beings. They're great role models. Now, what happens is, what do they do with their sadness? What do they do with their anger? How long do they allow their sadness and anger to control them? Is it momentary? Do they allow it to be their guide? A beautiful teaching about the tefillin in this Torah portion, it says that, but the tefillin, it says, and you should tie them on your hands, and it will be a totafet between your eyes. And so the sages say, why is the totafet in the brain, on the head, and it will be, and the totafet on the arm, which is opposite the heart, tied? Because it's much more work to control your emotions than it is to control your thoughts. Like your thoughts, in other words, an emotion takes you over more than a thought, in the sense that a thought, there's not so much work that has to get done to the thought comes and goes or whatever it is, and you could say, okay, I don't want that thought, go away. But an emotion takes us over. It's actually, when we ever experience an emotion, if we feel grief or we feel joy, or if we feel anger, it's very hard to rein it in, because it's emotional, and then yes, then the brain could calm down the mind, but it takes much more work. So yes, does Moshe get angry or sad? He's a human being. We don't have infallibility in the Torah, but we have great role models, so that yes, they may have a momentary feeling of frustration, anger, whatever it is, but immediately their training and their strength of character controls it. So that is what it means to be a great Jewish leader. It's not that you don't experience anything, you experience it, but you know exactly how to temper it and to put a lid on it, and you don't let it go. You don't let it just go wild. And that is really what a tzaddik is. A tzaddik is someone who can control their emotions very well. Maybe the Jews could also focus better on Moshe's teachings before entering the land and having to start building and planting. Yes, indeed. What are some of the signs that we fulfilled our mission? This is a great topic for another time. It's a Kabbalistic topic of why the signs that we fulfilled our mission. I don't know that a person could forever really know whatever they fulfilled their mission. There are stories, Kabbalistic stories that discuss that, but I think that we always have to operate under the premise that we have not yet fulfilled our mission, and that will keep us going. Again, the question that was asked. Okay, I think that is it. Someone spoke about the hatred that we have between us. Yes, this is, again, emotions are much harder to control than our thoughts. We all think well, we all want to do the right thing, but when we feel something, and often it's very guttural, and certainly this is true if someone like hurt us, sometimes what we feel is not even in our control. We just feel, you can feel it in your kishkes, as they say. So yeah, we have work to do, and we always have work to do. So with that, an extra half hour of questions. I bid everyone a wonderful week, a pleasant week, a week of growth, spiritual growth, and a week of inner strength, and a week of hope. It's a Shabbos Nachamu, a week of hope, and a week of reality that we need to have better. And may the inspiration of Moshe, of Tashma, of common hearing and listening, and be something that we work on and inculcate and give us the strength to do whatever we have to do.
Devorah, it's for the first time in my life that I truly understand the meaning of the tefillah, the totafot, because you it arrests the emotions that are, they're so fickle sometimes, and it connects them to the brain. So whatever the heart does, the brain commands how much of it should be acted
Absolutely.
upon.
And this is why, by the way, when men are specifically commanded with the mitzvah of tefillin, is because there's a notion that the impulse for certain things are much stronger in men than they are in women, and they need to have that extra help. So with that, I wish everyone a Shavua Tov, a blessed week.
Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you
Thank
for joining me, and look forward to the next class. And Devorah
And
is
a
a
peace
very,
in
very
Israel,
special-
Devorah, and a peace in Israel.
Shavua Tov.
Unity.
Thank you. Yes,
Love.
unity, love, peace, brotherhood, less judgmentalism, and we'll all be better off. I wish everyone a blessed week.